Ethan Reynolds was a man who had everything: money, power, and control over one of the most profitable tech corporations in the country. As the CEO of Reynolds Systems, he had built an empire, one that he ran with ruthless efficiency. To him, employees were numbers on a spreadsheet, tools to increase productivity and maximize revenue. But when complaints started piling up about low wages, toxic management, and burnout, he dismissed them as excuses from weak employees. If they don't like it, they can leave, he had told his board members. But one person refused to leave. Her name was Sophie Carter, a mid-level project manager who had been a thorn in his side for over a year. She was smart, outspoken, and hated everything about him. She called him a corporate tyrant. She led petitions for better working conditions. She had even been interviewed by a journalist where she described him as a heartless, greedy monster. And Ethan, he had never even met her. So when his board pressured him to fix the company's reputation, he came up with a brilliant idea. He would go undercover. Disguised as a new employee, he would work among his staff, prove how easy their jobs were, and catch Sophie in the act of stirring up rebellion. Then, when he revealed himself, he would shut her down once and for all. But what he never expected was that the very woman who hated him the most would be the one to turn his world upside down. And the worst part, he was about to fall for her. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below on what you would do in this situation. Ethan Reynolds had always prided himself on being a man of logic, control, and unshakable confidence. Running a multi-billion-dollar company required a cutthroat mindset, and he had never been the type to let emotions cloud his judgment. But as he sat in his luxury penthouse office, reviewing files about the woman who had become his biggest critic, he felt something strange. Annoyance. Sophie Carter. Her name appeared in almost every internal complaint. Whenever employees protested a new policy, she was behind it. When the media got hold of a negative story about Reynolds Systems, she had conveniently spoken to a journalist just a few weeks earlier. She was relentless. She had also refused multiple offers from other companies trying to poach her. Despite hating him, despite everything, she chose to stay. Why? Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at her photo in her personnel file. Dark brown hair, striking green eyes, sharp features that made her look like she never backed down from an argument. She probably thought she was untouchable, that she could stir up chaos in his company and get away with it. But Ethan had other plans. The undercover experiment would be simple. He would pose as an entry-level data analyst, working in the trenches of his own company. Sophie Carter would have no idea who he really was. And when he caught her violating company policies, he'd have all the evidence he needed to fire her and dismantle her movement. It was the perfect plan. At least that's what he thought. A week later, Ethan Reynolds ceased to exist. In his place stood Ethan Roberts, a supposedly new hire in the data analytics department. Instead of designer suits, he wore a simple button-down and jeans. His hair, usually slicked back with precision, was slightly ruffled to make him look less polished. For the first time in years, no one catered to him. No personal assistant, no luxury car waiting for him, no one rushing to meet his every demand. Just a dingy office with bad lighting, slow computers, and overworked employees. And Sophie Carter. She was even more intense in person. The moment he walked in, she barely spared him a glance before shoving a stack of reports into his hands. "New guy, right?" she said without looking up. Ethan blinked. Yeah, Ethan Roberts." "Great," she said, still not looking at him. "Try to keep up. We're already drowning in deadlines and our boss doesn't care." Ethan frowned. "Your boss doesn't care." She finally looked at him, her green eyes sharp. "You'll see for yourself soon enough. Welcome to hell." And with that, she walked away. For the first time in years, Ethan was treated like he didn't matter. It was humiliating. And for some reason, he couldn't stop staring at her. By the end of his first day, Ethan was exhausted. The job was far more demanding than he expected. He had assumed that corporate workers had it easy, sitting at desks, drinking coffee, clicking a few buttons. But this was brutal. The company's analytics software was outdated and full of glitches. Workloads were unrealistic. Employees were expected to analyze thousands of data points with barely any tools. Managers set insane deadlines and then blamed employees when they couldn't meet them. Ethan struggled to keep up. His first few assignments came back with red marks and corrections all over them. He made rookie mistakes that Sophie caught instantly. "New guy, what is this?" she said, holding up one of his reports. Ethan bristled. This formula is wrong. The data is completely misaligned. If we sent this up to the board, we'd all be in trouble." He gritted his teeth. If only she knew she was lecturing the very CEO who had signed her paycheck. But she didn't. And worst of all, she wasn't wrong. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "I'll fix it." "Good," she said, setting the paper down, "because if you don't, I will." She turned and walked away. Ethan exhaled sharply. This was going to be harder than he thought. By day 3, Ethan realized something even worse. Sophie Carter wasn't just smart. She was brilliant. She handled complex data problems faster than anyone in the office. She multitasked without breaking a sweat. And against his better judgment, Ethan found himself impressed. More than once, he caught himself watching her as she worked. She was so different from the people he usually surrounded himself with. She didn't kiss up to authority. She didn't care about pleasing executives. She only cared about the people in the trenches with her, which made her even more dangerous. He couldn't afford to be distracted by her. And yet, he was. By the end of the first week, Ethan had a problem. He was supposed to be gathering evidence against Sophie. Instead, he found himself wanting to understand her. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful meeting, he followed her to the break room. She leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "You okay?" he asked before he could stop himself. She looked at him surprised. "Yeah, just another day in corporate hell." "You really hate this place, huh?" She let out a dry laugh. "Hate isn't a strong enough word. The higher-ups don't care about us. They slash budgets, pile on work, and expect us to be grateful." Ethan hesitated, then why stay? For the first time, she didn't answer right away. She looked down at her coffee cup, expression unreadable. "Because someone has to fight back," she finally said. Ethan felt something shift. Before, he thought she was just a troublemaker. But now he saw something else. Sophie Carter wasn't in this for herself. She was fighting for everyone else. And Ethan had never met anyone like her. For the first time in his life, he wondered, what if he was wrong about everything? But before he could process it, something went horribly wrong. A company-wide email was sent out. An emergency budget cut from the CEO himself. Overtime was canceled. Bonuses were suspended indefinitely. Raises frozen for the rest of the year. The office erupted in chaos. People were furious. And Sophie, she was seething. She stood up in front of the entire department and said something that made Ethan's blood run cold. "I've had enough. If Ethan Reynolds won't listen to us, then it's time we force him to." The room erupted in agreement. And just like that, Sophie Carter had just declared war on him. The worst part, Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to fight back. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, but he wasn't seeing numbers or reports. His mind was stuck on Sophie Carter's words, the fire in her voice, the way the entire office had rallied around her. If Ethan Reynolds won't listen to us, then it's time we force him to. She was planning something. He could see it in the way employees whispered in clusters, the way emails were being sent outside of official channels. Something big was coming. The logical thing to do would be to report his findings to upper management immediately. He had all the evidence he needed to fire her and shut this down before it spread. But for the first time in his career, he hesitated. He had come into this experiment thinking that his employees were entitled and lazy, but after working alongside them for a week, he had seen firsthand how broken the system was. A system he had built. And Sophie. She wasn't just some loudmouth trying to stir up trouble. She was fighting for people who had no voice. He should be shutting her down. So why did he feel like he wanted to protect her instead? Over the next few days, the tension in the office grew thick enough to choke on. Sophie was careful, too careful. Ethan noticed she never spoke openly about what she was planning. She never wrote anything down, never sent emails that could be traced back to her. But the signs were there. People looked to her. Whenever a manager made an unfair demand, she was the first to challenge it. Whenever an employee was struggling under pressure, she stepped in. Ethan had spent years at the top, surrounded by executives who only cared about profits and growth. Now he was surrounded by people who cared about each other. It was unsettling. And somehow he found himself drawn to it. Drawn to her. One evening, Ethan stayed late, pretending to work while the office slowly emptied. He told himself he was doing it to gather more intel. But the truth, he was waiting for her. Sophie had a habit of staying after hours, finishing work when no one was around to breathe down her neck. Sure enough, as the office fell silent, she was still at her desk, typing furiously. Ethan hesitated, then, against all logic, he stood and walked over. Burning the midnight oil. She glanced up, surprised to see him still there. Deadlines don't care about office hours. He nodded, leaning against the edge of her desk. Neither do you, apparently. She smirked. I have a bad habit of caring too much. He wanted to say something. Something that would make her see him differently. Instead, she sighed and closed her laptop. I could use a drink, you in. Ethan should have said no. He should have walked away and stuck to the plan. Instead, he heard himself say, "Yeah, let's go." They ended up at a quiet bar a few blocks from the office, tucked into a booth in the corner. The moment she took her first sip of whiskey, Sophie let out a long breath, shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. I needed this, she admitted. Ethan watched her, fascinated. He had seen her as a warrior, constantly fighting, always ready for battle. But here, outside of work, she was human. He found himself wanting to know everything about her. What made you stay? He asked. She frowned. Stay where? At Reynolds Systems. If you hate the company so much, why not leave? She studied her drink for a moment before answering. Because I believe it can be better. Ethan blinked. He had expected her to say something about paychecks, stability, or lack of other options. But instead, she believed in fixing the company. She stirred her drink absent-mindedly. If I leave, nothing changes, but if I stay, maybe I can make a difference. Ethan's stomach twisted. Because for the first time, he saw what she saw. And the worst part, he wanted her to win. The night stretched on, conversation flowing easily. They talked about everything except work. She told him about how she grew up fixing old computers with her dad, how she had gotten into tech because she wanted to create things that made people's lives easier. And Ethan. He told her about traveling the world as a kid, how he had spent most of his life chasing success because his father drilled it into his head that winning was everything. At some point, he realized she was watching him differently. Like she was seeing more than just the new guy at work. And God help him, he wanted her too. But he couldn't let her. Not when he was lying about who he really was. The next day at work, everything fell apart. An anonymous email was sent to every single employee in the company. Inside was a detailed manifesto outlining every corrupt policy, every abusive practice, every reason why Reynolds Systems needed to change. At the bottom of the email, a call to action. A protest right outside corporate headquarters. Ethan's blood ran cold. The employees weren't just complaining anymore. They were going to war. And at the heart of it, Sophie Carter, the woman he was supposed to bring down. The woman he had spent the past week falling for. He had a choice. Turn her in, or risk everything. Ethan had never felt this kind of pressure before. Millions of dollars were at stake, his reputation, his control. Everything he had built could crumble overnight. He sat in a meeting with his executive team, listening as they scrambled to respond. Whoever sent that email needs to be fired immediately. This protest could turn into a PR disaster. We need to shut this down before it gains traction. Ethan clenched his jaw. They were talking about Sophie. And suddenly, he didn't feel like he was on their side. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if they were the good guys. He stood abruptly. I'll handle it. The executives looked at him, surprised. But, sir, I said I'll handle it. And without another word, he left the room. He found Sophie at her desk, tense and focused. Hey, he said. She barely glanced up. Now's not the time, Ethan. But he couldn't wait. We need to talk alone. Something in his voice made her pause. After a moment, she nodded. They stepped into an empty conference room. Sophie crossed her arms. What is it? Ethan took a deep breath. And then, he said the words that would change everything. Sophie, I'm not who you think I am. She frowned. What? He exhaled sharply. My name isn't Ethan Roberts. He held her gaze. It's Ethan Reynolds. The color drained from her face. Silence filled the room. Then, her expression hardened. You lied to me. Ethan swallowed. I had to, but Everything, her voice was low, dangerous. Every single thing you told me was a lie. No, he said quickly, not everything. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I trusted you. Pain twisted in his chest. I never meant to hurt you, he said. But it was too late. Sophie Carter wasn't just furious. She was done with him. And worst of all, Ethan realized he might have just lost the only person who ever made him want to be better. Ethan had faced plenty of crises in his career, hostile takeovers, market crashes, lawsuits threatening his company's survival, but nothing compared to the storm brewing in front of him. Sophie Carter, the woman he had spent the past week growing closer to, the woman he had started to admire, respect, and maybe even feel something deeper for stood in front of him, radiating pure fury. "You lied to me," she repeated, voice sharp as a blade. "Sophie, I—" "Don't," she cut him off. "Don't stand there and pretend you ever had good intentions. This was a game to you, wasn't it? Some sick experiment." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle deep into his chest. This wasn't how he wanted her to find out. At the start, yes, it had been an experiment, a way to expose her, control her, get rid of her. But now, it was so much more than that. And the fact that she couldn't see it, wouldn't believe him, stung more than it should have. "I didn't plan for it to happen like this," he admitted. Her laugh was bitter. "How was it supposed to happen, Ethan? You gather dirt on me, have me fired, then march back up to your penthouse office like none of this ever mattered." He clenched his jaw. That was the plan, but things changed. "Really, what changed?" she challenged, eyes blazing. "You." He almost said it. Almost told her that she was the reason everything was different now. That she had made him see his company, his choices, in a way he never had before. That he had started questioning everything because of her. But before he could find the words, Sophie shook her head, stepping back. "It doesn't matter," she muttered, "because none of this is real. You were just playing a role." He hated the way that sounded. Because it was real. At least to him. But how could he convince her of that now? "Are you going to fire me?" she asked flatly. Ethan exhaled, "No." Sophie's lips pressed together in a tight line. "Of course not, because that would be too easy, right? You need to keep playing your little game." He stepped toward her. "I never meant to hurt you, Sophie, I swear." Her eyes flashed. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to stand there and act like you give a damn about anyone but yourself." That hit harder than it should have. Before he could stop himself, he said, "I care about you." Her breath hitched, but only for a second. Then she laughed coldly. "Right, that's what you tell all your employees before you screw them over." "Sophie, let's leave it." She turned, storming toward the door. Panic surged through him. If she walked out now, he might never get another chance to fix this. "Sophie, please." She whirled around so fast, he almost ran into her. "You know what's funny, Ethan?" Her voice shook, but not with fear, with anger, with betrayal. "For a second, I actually believed you were different." Then, with one last look of disgust, she walked out. And this time, Ethan knew. She wasn't coming back. Ethan barely remembered the hours that followed. He sat in his office, staring blankly at the city skyline, trying to figure out when, exactly, he had lost control. The moment he had agreed to go undercover. The moment he had started admiring Sophie instead of working against her. Or was it when he realized that he didn't want to run Reynolds Systems the same way anymore? It didn't matter now. Because no matter what he wanted, Sophie hated him. And tomorrow, when the protest happened outside Reynolds Systems headquarters, she would be lighting it. Against him. Against everything he stood for. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop her. The next morning, chaos erupted. Hundreds of employees gathered outside Reynolds Systems, holding signs, chanting, demanding change. News outlets swarmed the streets, cameras capturing every second of it. And at the center of it all, Sophie Carter. Ethan stood by the boardroom window, watching as she spoke into a megaphone, her voice clear, determined. "This company belongs to all of us, not just the executives in their glass towers." The crowd roared. Ethan turned away from the window. His executives were panicking. "This is a disaster. We need to shut it down now." Call the police. No. Silence fell. The entire room turned to look at him. Ethan exhaled, his decision already made. They're not the problem, he said, voice calm. We are. Murmurs of confusion filled the air. Martin Ross, his COO, narrowed his eyes. You can't be serious. Ethan met his gaze. I've never been more serious in my life. Then, before anyone could stop him, he walked out of the boardroom, straight down to the protest. The moment Sophie saw him approaching, her expression darkened. She lowered the megaphone, eyes burning with hatred. You're not welcome here, she said coldly. Ethan didn't flinch, I know. A few employees shouted at him, telling him to leave, but he didn't move. He looked at Sophie, and for the first time, he spoke the truth. You're right, he said, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. This company has been broken for a long time, and I built it that way. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Sophie's eyes narrowed. What are you doing? Fixing what I should have fixed a long time ago. Then, in front of everyone, he pulled a stack of signed papers from his coat pocket and held them up. The wage freeze gone. The crowd stilled. The budget cuts reversed. Murmurs of disbelief spread. Overtime pay restored. Now employees were staring at him, stunned. He wasn't just making promises. He had already put it in writing. And then he looked at Sophie, really looked at her. I didn't listen before, he admitted, but I'm listening now. Sophie searched his face, looking for a trick, a lie. But there wasn't one. And for the first time since she had met him, she didn't know what to say. A week later, the office felt different. Lighter, more alive. People walked past Ethan's desk, his actual desk now, not the one in the trenches, and smiled. Some still didn't trust him. He didn't blame them. He had a lot of work to do. But when Sophie walked in, hesitating for the first time, he knew that this was his real challenge. I heard you're approving funding for the employee wellness program, she said carefully. I am, he said. She studied him. Why? Ethan met her gaze. Because you were right. Sophie crossed her arms. That easy, huh? No, he admitted, nothing about this is easy, but it's the right thing to do. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. Good. And for the first time since this all began, she didn't look at him like he was the enemy anymore. Ethan Reynolds walked into his own company believing he had everything figured out. He thought his employees were complainers, that their struggles were over-exaggerated, and that Sophie Carter was nothing more than a troublemaker. But after spending weeks in their world, after seeing how broken his own system was, and after falling for the one person who wanted to take him down, he realized how wrong he had been. Sophie taught him what it meant to lead, not from the top, but from within. And in the end, she didn't just change his company. She changed him. What do you think? Would Sophie ever truly forgive Ethan? Let us know in the comments. If you love stories with unexpected twists, workplace drama, and enemies to lovers romance, make sure to like this video. Subscribe for more crazy undercover boss stories. Comment below, what would you do if your CEO worked alongside you in disguise? Turn on notifications so you never miss a new